I never thought shoveling snow for my neighbors would lead to a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It all started with a simple desire for a quiet life and ended with sheriff's deputies, felony charges, and the complete implosion of our neighborhood's governing body. The funny thing is, the woman who started it all by having my truck towed never bothered to ask what I did for a living. If she had, she might have saved herself a whole lot of trouble. My name is Jack, and for the past 15 years, my professional life has revolved around other people's vehicular mistakes. I'm the manager of the Franklin County impound lot. It's a strange job. I see folks at their lowest, pleading, angry, or just plain defeated, all because their car ended up in my care. I've learned to be patient, firm, and fair. I follow the rules, but I also know that behind every towed vehicle is a human story. My work has made me appreciate the value of peace and quiet, which is why I bought my house in Oak Creek Estates a decade ago. Oak Creek was the perfect antidote to my job. It was a sleepy collection of about 80 single-family homes, nestled in a wooded corner of the county. The kind of place where you knew your immediate neighbors by name, you'd wave as you got the mail, and you'd lend a cup of sugar without a second thought. Our homeowners association was, for the first 9 years I lived there, a benign and largely invisible entity. We paid our modest annual dues, and in return, the grass at the front entrance was mowed, the little sign was kept freshly painted, and the playground equipment in the community park didn't rust into a tetanus hazard. Meetings were held once a year, sparsely attended, and usually concluded in under 20 minutes. It was perfect. It was a community, not a corporation. That all changed when Carol moved in. She and her husband, a perpetually silent man named Bill, bought the corner house on the main loop about 2 years back. Carol was a woman who seemed to be vibrating with a restless managerial energy. We learned quickly that she was a recently retired office administrator from some mid-level corporate firm, and she brought her passion for binders, memos, and rigid hierarchies with her. She saw the relaxed nature of our HOA not as a feature, but as a bug, a critical system failure. Within 3 months, she'd attended her first HOA meeting. Within 6, she had volunteered to be the secretary. She produced voluminous, professionally formatted minutes for our 20-minute chats. She created subcommittees for beautification and compliance. At the 1-year mark, with most of the residents either bemused or too busy to care, she ran for president on a vague but ominous platform of restoring standards and protecting property values. She won, mostly because she was the only one who actually wanted the job. The changes started small, like a slowly rising tide of petty restrictions. First came the newsletter. It was a glossy, full-color production that arrived monthly, detailing the new enforcement priorities. The first edition decreed that all mailboxes had to be a uniform, specific shade of black, Sherwin-Williams tricorn black, satin finish, model HG7658 to be exact. A few people grumbled, but it was a $10 can of spray paint, so most of us just did it. Then came the rules about lawn ornaments. No gnomes, no flamingos, no decorative flags except the American flag, and only on designated federal holidays. Trash cans became a major point of contention. They could not be visible from the street, except for a 12-hour window on collection day. This was a problem for people like the Hendersons, an older couple who had trouble wrangling the heavy bins up their steep driveway. I'd often see Mr. Henderson struggling and would jog over to help him. He'd thank me, shaking his head. Never had to worry about where a trash can was sitting for 40 years in this neighborhood, he'd mutter. But again, most people just complied. It was easier than fighting. Carol's newsletters grew more condescending, featuring neighborhood watch sections with anonymous photos of violations, a basketball hoop left out overnight, a garden hose not perfectly coiled. A quiet layer of paranoia began to settle over the easygoing atmosphere of Oak Creek. We were still neighbors, but now we were also potential infractions. The real trouble, the event that turned me from a compliant, conflict-averse resident into a reluctant rebel, arrived in the form of the biggest snowstorm our county had seen in 50 years. It was a monster. The weather forecasters called it a snowpocalypse, and for once, they weren't exaggerating. Over 2.5 feet of heavy, wet snow fell in less than 24 hours. The world went silent, buried under a thick white blanket. It was beautiful for about an hour, and then it became a serious problem. The county was completely overwhelmed. Main arteries were the priority, and residential streets in unincorporated areas like ours were at the bottom of the list. By the second day after the storm, our neighborhood was effectively cut off. The snow was too deep for most cars, and the single lane the county plow had managed to carve down our main road was already drifting over. People were stuck. I heard that Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived alone 3 doors down, had missed a doctor's appointment. This was the kind of situation where my professional life and personal skills overlapped. I owned a 3/4-ton Ford F-250, a beast of a truck I used for hauling things for the house and for weekend projects. Bolted to the front of it was a heavy-duty personal snowplow. I bought it for my own long, winding driveway, but I knew it was more than capable of handling our neighborhood streets. So, on Saturday morning, I fired it up. The diesel engine rumbled to life, a welcome sound in the oppressive silence. I spent the next 6 hours clearing every street in the Oak Creek Estates loop. I carved out paths, widened the main thoroughfare, and cleared the areas around the mailboxes. It was hard work, but it felt good. People waved from their windows, and a few hardy souls came out with shovels to thank me and clear their own walkways. After clearing the roads, I made a point to plow out the driveways of the elderly residents I knew would struggle. I did Mr. Henderson's first, and then I drove down to Mrs. Gable's house. Her driveway was a solid, untouched wall of white. It took me 20 minutes, but I cleared it right up to her garage door. She came out, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Oh, Jack, you're a lifesaver," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was so worried. Thank you, dear. Thank you." Seeing the relief on her face was all the payment I needed. That was what being a neighbor was about. To do all this work effectively, I had to maneuver the large truck and plow constantly. This sometimes meant leaving it parked on the street for a few minutes while I used a shovel for tighter areas or took a quick break. It was during one of these breaks, as I stood in my own driveway catching my breath and drinking a bottle of water, that the war officially began. I saw her marching down the street, a small, determined figure in a bright pink parka. It was Carol. She wasn't coming to thank me. Her face was set in a mask of grim purpose. She didn't stop at the edge of my property but marched right up my freshly cleared driveway until she was standing a few feet away. She didn't say hello. She didn't acknowledge the hours of work I just put in for the benefit of the entire community. She just pointed a gloved finger at my truck, which was parked on the street in front of my house. "You can't park that here," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard her. "Excuse me? That is a commercial vehicle," she stated, as if reading from a script. "It has a plow attached to it. Our bylaws are perfectly clear. HOA Bylaw 17, Section C, Paragraph 2, explicitly prohibits the parking of any commercial, industrial, or agricultural equipment on community streets. You need to move it immediately." I stared at her, a profound sense of disbelief washing over me. The entire neighborhood was just emerging from a state of paralysis because of that truck and that plow. "Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice even and reasonable. "There's been a record-breaking snowstorm. The county can't get to us. I'm just trying to clear the roads so people can get out, so Mrs. Gable can get her prescriptions, so the mail can be delivered." She was completely unmoved. It was like talking to a brick wall, if a brick wall could look at you with smug condescension. "The bylaws do not have a clause for weather-related exemptions," she said flatly. "They exist to maintain the residential character and aesthetic standards of our community. That thing," she gestured at my truck with disgust, "is an eyesore and a flagrant violation. I am giving you a formal, verbal warning. Move it off the street and onto your own property, or I will be forced to begin fining you." I felt a surge of hot anger, but I pushed it down. Arguing with a zealot is a waste of breath. "Carol, I'm not finished. I still have a few more driveways to clear for people who can't do it themselves. I need to have the truck on the street to maneuver. It will be gone when I'm done." Her eyes narrowed. "That is not acceptable. The rules are the rules. This is your one and only warning, Jack. I will not have our community standards degraded by industrial equipment just because of a little snow." She turned on her heel and marched back down the street, her pink parka a beacon of righteous indignation in the sea of white. I stood there for a long moment, the cold air biting at my face, and I understood that this was no longer about a little snow. This was about power, and she had just declared war. I took a deep breath, looked at my truck, and then down the street towards the homes that still needed help. I made a decision. The community's immediate well-being was more important than the petty tyranny of one woman. I got back in my truck and went back to work. An hour later, tucked under my windshield wiper, was a crisp white envelope. Inside was a formal violation notice and a bill for a $50 fine, complete with a time-stamped photo of my truck parked on the street. The war had officially begun, and she had fired the first shot. The next day, Sunday, I woke up determined to finish what I had started. A few of the younger families still had impassable driveways, and I wanted to widen the main path through the neighborhood before the temperature dropped and everything froze into solid ice. I knew it meant defying Carol, but at this point, it was a matter of principle. My truck and plow were a tool for helping my neighbors, not an industrial eyesore. I spent the morning plowing, and just as before, I had to occasionally leave the truck on the street to clear tight spots with a shovel. The gratitude from the families I helped was palpable. One couple brought me out a thermos of hot coffee. Another, a young family with a toddler, gave me a hand-drawn card from their child, a crayon scribble of a big red truck pushing snow. These small gestures reinforced my conviction that I was doing the right thing. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. By lunchtime, another envelope had appeared on my windshield. This time, the fine was for $100, citing it as a second offense. The notice included a new, more threatening line. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and eventual removal of the offending vehicle at the owner's expense. The sheer audacity was stunning. She was threatening to tow the very vehicle that was making the neighborhood functional again. I crumpled the notice in my fist and tossed it onto the passenger seat with the first one. The impact of my plowing became clear on Monday morning. A school bus was able to navigate our streets to pick up the neighborhood kids. The mail truck made its rounds for the first time in 4 days. Most critically, a home health aide was able to get to Mrs. Gable's house for her weekly wellness check. Mrs. Gable called me later that day, her voice filled with emotion. "The nurse said they wouldn't have even tried to come if the road hadn't been so clear, Jack. You really are a blessing." My other neighbors were appreciative, but also wary. They would thank me in hushed tones when they saw me getting my mail. "Hey Jack, thanks so much for the plowing, man. We really appreciate it," one neighbor, Dave, said while glancing nervously toward Carol's house. "But you know, be careful. Carol is on a rampage." It was clear they supported me, but they were intimidated. Years of her petty enforcement had conditioned them to avoid her wrath at all costs. I was on my own. The fines kept coming. By Wednesday, I had a collection of 4 notices on my passenger seat, totaling $350. The fourth one, for $200, came with another note, this one handwritten in an aggressive, spiky script. "This is your final warning. If the vehicle is found on the street again, it will be towed." I finally decided this had crossed the line from petty annoyance to serious harassment. That evening, I received a certified letter from the Oak Creek Estates HOA Compliance Committee, which was, of course, just Carol. It was a formal declaration that a lien would be placed on my property if the fines, now totaling $350, were not paid within 30 days. A lien on my house for helping my neighbors. That was the moment I realized I couldn't just ignore this away. This woman was genuinely unhinged in her pursuit of control. I needed professional help. The next day, I took the afternoon off work and went to see a lawyer. His name was David Chen, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in real estate and contract law. I had met him a few years prior through a mutual acquaintance. I sat in his neat, modern office and laid out the whole story. I showed him the stack of fines, the threatening letter about the lien, and photos I'd taken of the work I'd done. I explained the context of the storm and the gratitude of my neighbors. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable as he examined the documents. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Well, Jack," he began, "you found yourself in a classic petty tyrant situation. The good news is that her actions are, on their face, completely unreasonable. A judge would likely see it that way in the end." He paused. "The bad news is that HOAs have a shocking amount of power. The bylaws are a contract you agreed to when you bought your house. And this woman, Carol, seems to be following the letter of that contract, however absurdly." He picked up one of the violation notices. "Bylaw 17, Section C. Does it say what she claims it says?" "I assume so," I admitted. "I never read the fine print that closely when I moved in. Nobody did." "That's how they get you," David said with a grim smile. "She's technically within her rights to issue fines based on the bylaws. Placing a lien for unpaid fines is also a standard, if aggressive, tool in the HOA playbook. Fighting this in court would be expensive and time-consuming. We could win, but it would cost you thousands." My heart sank. "So what do I do? Just pay her? Let her win?" "No," David said, his eyes sharpening. "We don't let bullies win. We just have to be smarter. We fight back, but not on her terms. The best defense against a bureaucrat is more bureaucracy." He leaned forward. "As a homeowner, you have the right to inspect the HOA's financial records. All of them. Invoices, bank statements, meeting minutes, contracts, everything." "What are we looking for?" I asked. David's smile returned, but this time it was predatory. "People like this, people obsessed with control and who believe they are the smartest person in any room, often get sloppy. They start to see the HOA's money as their money. You mentioned your dues have doubled since she took over?" I nodded. "Mr. Henderson, one of the original homeowners, pointed that out. He said we're paying twice as much for more rules and less pleasantness." "Exactly," David said. "So, we start there. I'll draft a formal request for a complete financial audit on your behalf. She is legally obligated to comply within a certain time frame. Let's see if her bookkeeping is as pristine as her vision for the neighborhood's mailboxes." Leaving David's office, I felt a shift inside me. The frustration and anger were still there, but now they were focused. I was no longer just a guy being harassed. I was an investigator. I went home and started my own, less formal investigation. I spoke to Mr. Henderson again. He was a retired accountant and had a keen eye for details. He confirmed the exact date the dues had doubled and recalled that the justification was vague. Something about increased landscaping costs and administrative fees. "Landscaping?" Mr. Henderson scoffed. "The only thing that's changed is she had some fancy new flower beds put in around the entrance sign. It looked nice, I guess, but not double the dues nice." The pieces were beginning to click into place. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about a potential abuse of power that affected every single person in our neighborhood. Carol thought she was in a battle with me over a parking violation. She had no idea I was about to start looking into her entire reign. The investigation had begun. The formal request for financial records, drafted by David Chen and sent via certified mail, was met with predictable resistance. Carol responded with an email stating that the records were currently undergoing an internal quarterly review and would not be available for at least 60 days. David immediately fired back a letter informing her that state law mandated access within 10 business days and that her delay constituted a breach of her fiduciary duty. He politely mentioned that our next step would be to file a court order to compel their release, a process that would make the HOA liable for all associated legal fees. The threat worked. A week later, I received a terse email from Carol instructing me to pick up a box of documents from her front porch. It felt like a trap, but I went anyway. On her perfectly manicured porch sat a single, unsealed banker's box. It was a mess. The box was filled with a chaotic jumble of loose receipts, crumpled invoices, and bank statements printed on cheap paper. There was no order, no ledger, no coherence. It was either sheer incompetence or a deliberate attempt to make the records impossible to decipher. My money was on the latter. I took the box straight to Mr. Henderson's house. He had eagerly volunteered to help, his old accountant's instincts sparked by the challenge. We spread the contents across his large dining room table. "Good heavens," he murmured, peering through his bifocals at the chaotic pile of paper. "This isn't bookkeeping. This is a fire hazard." While we began the painstaking process of sorting through the financial mess, Carol made her final, fatal move. I came home from a long day at the county lot to an unnerving sight. The spot on the street in front of my house where I normally parked my F-250 was empty. My truck was gone. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had been stolen. Then I saw the small white envelope taped to my front door. My blood ran cold. I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy from a private towing company. Scrawled across the bottom in Carol's familiar, aggressive handwriting was a triumphant message. "As per my final warning, your non-compliant vehicle has been removed from community property. All towing and impound fees are your responsibility. All inquiries should be directed to A and B Towing. Let this be a lesson to all who disregard our community bylaws." I stood there on my porch, reading and rereading the note. A slow, incredulous smile spread across my face. A and B Towing. I knew them. They were one of the smaller, scrappier outfits in the county. They handled private property impounds, mostly from apartment complexes and shopping centers. And like every other towing company that operated within Franklin County, they had a contract for vehicle storage. A contract with my facility. They didn't have their own lot large enough to securely store vehicles for more than a few hours. So, when they towed a car for impound, they brought it to the official, secure, county-regulated lot. They brought it to me. She had towed my truck and had it delivered directly to the place where I was the boss. The sheer, unadulterated irony was so thick I could almost taste it. This was it. This was the turning point. She had meant to deliver a finishing blow, a public humiliation. Instead, she had handed me the perfect weapon. My first call was to my own office. I got my night supervisor, a steady guy named Marcus. "Marcus, it's Jack," I said, trying to keep the laughter out of my voice. "Did an F-250, license plate Kilo Juliet November 5884, happen to get checked in from A and B Towing within the last few hours?" There was a pause and the sound of keyboard clicks. "Yeah, boss, it's here. Checked in about an hour ago. Towed from some HOA, Oak Creek Estates. Paperwork says it's a bylaw violation." "Why? You know the owner." "You could say that, Marcus," I replied. "It's my truck." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Then, a low whistle. "No way. You're kidding me." "I wish I were," I said, the humor finally bubbling over into a chuckle. "Listen, do me a favor. Process it by the book, exactly by the book. Full intake report, photos from every angle, document the plow attachment as non-standard equipment. Log the reason for the tow as owner in violation of HOA Bylaw 17C. But do not, under any circumstances, release it to anyone but me. And don't charge me for storage. We'll call it a professional courtesy." "You got it, boss," Marcus said, the glee evident in his voice. "Consider it done. This is going to be a good story." My next call was to David Chen. I explained what had happened. He was silent for a moment, and then he let out a loud, genuine laugh. "Oh, that is beautiful, Jack. That is poetic justice. She has no idea who she's dealing with." "So what's our move?" I asked, my mind racing. "This changes the game," David said, his voice now sharp and strategic. "This isn't just harassment anymore. It's a wrongful tow. She, acting as an agent of the HOA, authorized the removal of your personal property from what is likely a public right-of-way. Even if the street is owned by the HOA, her basis is flimsy and retaliatory. We now have a concrete tort claim against the HOA, but we don't file it yet. We hold it. This is our ace in the hole," he continued. "Meanwhile, you and Mr. Henderson need to find something in that box of receipts. Her overreach with the tow tells me she's arrogant, and arrogant people make mistakes. Find one." His words were all the motivation I needed. I went straight back to Mr. Henderson's house. We worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. We sorted the receipts by vendor and by date. A pattern began to emerge. There were dozens of receipts from a company called Evergreen Management Solutions. The invoices were for vague services like community consultation, administrative support, and bylaw review. The fees were exorbitant, thousands of dollars every month. "I've never heard of this company," Mr. Henderson said, frowning. "Have you?" I shook my head. On a hunch, I pulled out my laptop and did a search for Evergreen Management Solutions in the state's business registry. Nothing came up. Then I searched for the address listed on the invoices. It was a residential address, a very familiar residential address. "Mr. Henderson," I said slowly, turning the laptop screen towards him. "Look at this." It was Carol and Bill's address. The invoices were from a phantom company, billed from their own home. But the smoking gun was the payment records. The HOA's bank statements showed checks written to Evergreen Management Solutions. But when we found the corresponding canceled checks, they weren't endorsed by a business. They were endorsed by William J., last name, and deposited directly into Carol and Bill's personal joint bank account. We had her. It was clear, undeniable fraud. She was using a fake company to funnel HOA dues directly into her own pocket. All the talk of standards and rules was a smokescreen to justify raising the dues she was actively embezzling. I looked at Mr. Henderson. His face was pale with anger. "The nerve of that woman," he whispered. "Stealing from her own neighbors." I gathered up the evidence, the fake invoices, the bank statements, the canceled checks. My heart was pounding. This was bigger than my truck. This was grand larceny. My strategy shifted instantly. I was no longer on the defensive, trying to protect my property from a bully. I was now on the offensive, armed with irrefutable proof of criminal activity. Carol wanted a war over bylaws. She was about to find herself in a war over felonies. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time to go public. With David Chen's guidance, we planned our counteroffensive. The first step was to call for a special meeting of the Homeowners Association. According to the bylaws, the very rules Carol held so sacred, a meeting could be called if a petition was signed by at least 25% of the homeowners. Getting the signatures was easier than I expected. My quiet, intimidated neighbors had reached their breaking point. The story of my truck being towed, combined with whispers of the double dues, had created a groundswell of anger. Within 2 days, we had signatures from over half the households in Oak Creek Estates. We scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday evening in the small community clubhouse, a building that hadn't seen this much excitement since its dedication. I spent the weekend with David and Mr. Henderson preparing our presentation. We made copies of everything: the fraudulent invoices from Evergreen Management Solutions, the bank statements showing the payments, and the damning images of the canceled checks endorsed by Carol's husband. We put together a clear, chronological slideshow. David advised me on the precise language to use: stick to the facts, present the evidence, and let the conclusions speak for themselves. The evening of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. I'd never seen more than a dozen people at an HOA meeting before, but tonight there must have been over 100 residents crammed into the small room. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. People were standing along the walls and spilling out the doorway. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Carol and the 2 other board members, a pair of nervous-looking men who had always acted as her rubber stamps, sat at a folding table at the front. Carol appeared supremely confident, even smug. She clearly believed this meeting was about my truck. She probably thought the residents were there to watch her publicly shame me. She opened the meeting by banging a small gavel. "Welcome," she began, a tight, unpleasant smile on her face. "This special meeting has been called by a minority of residents. We will first address the agenda items submitted by the petitioners, after which the board will provide an update on recent, successful compliance enforcement actions." She looked directly at me as she said it, a glint of triumph in her eyes. Mr. Henderson, as the most senior resident present, had been designated to speak first. He stood up, his voice trembling slightly with age but firm with conviction. "Carol, We are here tonight because many of us are deeply concerned about the direction our community is heading. We are concerned about the atmosphere of suspicion, and we are concerned about the management of our funds. Carol's smile tightened. All expenditures are fully accounted for and in line with our mission to protect and enhance property values, as I'm sure you're aware. We'll get to the expenditures in a moment, I said, stepping forward. It was my turn. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me. I took a deep breath. But first, Carol, I'd like to talk about your successful compliance enforcement action. I looked around the room. As many of you know, last week, Carol authorized a private company to tow my truck, which was parked in front of my own home. She did this under the justification that I was violating an HOA bylaw. A murmur went through the crowd. She left me a note, I continued, holding up the piece of paper, informing me that the truck had been removed and that all fees were my responsibility. She did this, she claims, to uphold community standards. What she probably didn't count on, I paused for effect, is where it was towed to. You see, the county requires private tow operators to store impounded vehicles at a secure, licensed facility. There's only one of those in Franklin County. It's the one I manage. A wave of shocked gasps and then scattered laughter rippled through the room. I saw Carol's face. Her smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a flash of confusion and then dawning horror. Her jaw went slack. "So I'd like to personally thank you, Carol, for the business," I said, my voice dripping with irony. "The initial tow fee charged by A and B is $250. The administrative processing fee at my lot is $75. And the daily storage fee for an oversized vehicle with non-standard attachments is $85 per day. My truck has been in my lot for 6 days now, so that's another $510. The total to get my truck back is currently $835. Of course, as the lot manager, I have the discretion to waive fees, which I did for myself, but I found the paperwork very illuminating. I let that sink in. Her face had gone from pale to a blotchy, furious red. "This is outrageous! You have no right!" "But this isn't about my truck," I cut her off, my voice rising in volume and authority. I turned to face the rest of the room. "This is about our money, your money." That's when I clicked the remote for the projector. The first slide appeared on the screen behind Carol, showing the HOA's budget from 2 years ago, before she was president. The next slide showed the budget from last year. The line item for total dues collected had nearly doubled. "As you all know, our dues have skyrocketed," I said. "We were told this was for increased administrative and landscaping costs." So Mr. Henderson and I decided to look at the books. The next slide showed an invoice from Evergreen Management Solutions for $3,000 for bylaw consultation. I clicked again. Another invoice, this time for $2,500 for community administrative support. I went through 5 of them, each for a different month, each for a similar exorbitant amount. This company, Evergreen Management Solutions, has been paid over $30,000 from our HOA account in the last year alone, I announced. Strange, since none of us have ever heard of them. Even stranger, they don't seem to exist in the state business registry. I looked directly at Carol, whose face was now a mask of pure panic. But we did find an address on the invoices. I clicked to the next slide. It showed a screenshot of the county property database. "It's your address, Carol." The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing. The 2 board members next to her looked physically ill. They began inching their chairs away from her. "You're lying," Carol shrieked, jumping to her feet. "This is slander. It's a fabrication." "Is it?" I asked calmly, and clicked to the final, damning slide. It was a high-resolution image of a canceled check from the Oak Creek Estates HOA account, made payable to Evergreen Management Solutions. And on the back, clear as day, was the endorsement signature, William J., last name, followed by the account number for their personal joint bank account. Silence. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the room. The evidence was irrefutable. She had been caught red-handed. Her authority, her entire facade of righteous order, crumbled to dust in that single moment. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just sputtered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally, finding only a sea of angry, betrayed faces. You snake," she finally hissed at me, her voice dripping with venom. "You will be hearing from my lawyer." She grabbed her purse and stormed towards the exit, pushing people out of her way. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of disgust and contempt. Just as she reached the door, it opened. A uniformed sheriff's deputy stepped inside, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Evening, folks," he said, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. "We got a call about a possible disturbance?" Mr. Henderson pointed a trembling finger at the fleeing Carol. "That woman, deputy," he said, his voice ringing with clarity. "She's been stealing from us." The deputy's eyes locked onto Carol. Her escape was cut off. Her reign was over. The aftermath of the meeting was swift and decisive. The sheriff's deputy took initial statements from me, Mr. Henderson, and several other homeowners right there in the clubhouse. He took the box of financial records and the presentation materials as evidence. Carol and her husband Bill were asked to remain at their home. The next morning, a detective from the county's financial crimes unit arrived at my door. I spent 2 hours walking him through every detail of our investigation, from the first suspicious invoice to the final canceled check. Within a week, the district attorney's office had convened a grand jury. Armed with our meticulously organized evidence and testimony from a dozen residents, they handed down indictments against both Carol and Bill. Carol was charged with multiple counts of felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Bill was charged as a co-conspirator. Their carefully constructed world of manicured lawns and iron-fisted rule came crashing down. The legal process was slow, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. 6 months later, facing a mountain of proof and abandoned by her expensive lawyer once her stolen funds ran out, Carol accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony grand larceny. Her husband, Bill, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. The judge was not lenient, citing the egregious breach of trust against her own neighbors, many of whom were elderly and on fixed incomes. He sentenced her to 2 years in a state correctional facility. Bill received 5 years of probation and was ordered to perform 500 hours of community service. Crucially, they were ordered to pay full restitution to the Oak Creek Estates HOA, a sum totaling just over $45,000. For me, the vindication was absolute. The day after the disastrous meeting, the 2 remaining board members resigned in disgrace. An emergency interim board was formed, with Mr. Henderson unanimously elected as its president. Their first official act was to pass a resolution formally voiding all fines levied against me. They sent me a letter, hand-delivered by Mr. Henderson himself, offering a profound apology on behalf of the community and thanking me for exposing the corruption. The illegal lien that had been threatened against my home vanished as if it had never existed. My reputation in the neighborhood transformed overnight. I was no longer the guy with the loud truck. I was the guy who had saved the neighborhood. With Carol gone, a palpable sense of relief settled over Oak Creek. It was like a long, dark storm cloud had finally passed. The first thing the new board did was to hold a community-wide meeting to rewrite the bylaws. With David Chen's pro bono help, we went through them line by line, striking out the absurd and ambiguous rules Carol had instituted. We drafted new guidelines based on common sense and mutual respect, not on a desire for absolute control. The new rule about commercial vehicles, for instance, now included a clear exemption for temporary work, emergencies, and providing neighborly assistance. The stolen money, once it was repaid as part of the restitution, was put to good use. We repaved the cracked asphalt on the main loop, installed beautiful new modern equipment in the playground, and hosted a huge community barbecue to celebrate our liberation. People started talking to each other again. Kids left their basketball hoops out. A few brave souls even put garden gnomes back on their lawns. The neighborhood felt more alive and more connected than it ever had before. We had gone through a trial by fire together, and it had forged us into a true community. The oppressive silence of Carol's reign was replaced by the comfortable, easygoing sounds of neighborly life. 2.5 years passed. The memory of Carol's tyranny began to fade, becoming more of a local legend than a painful memory. Oak Creek Estates was thriving. The reformed HOA was a model of quiet efficiency, and our neighborhood had gained a reputation as one of the friendliest and most well-run communities in the county. Property values, the very thing Carol claimed to be protecting, had risen significantly. One dreary Tuesday afternoon, I had to run to a discount grocery store on the far side of the county to pick up some specialty cleaning supplies for the lot. As I was heading down the canned goods aisle, I saw her. It was Carol. The 2 years in prison had not been kind. Her hair was limp and streaked with gray. The confident, aggressive posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. She wore cheap, ill-fitting clothes and pushed a rickety cart with only a few generic items inside. She looked diminished, a ghost of the petty tyrant she once was. Our eyes met for a brief second across a pyramid of canned peas. I saw a flicker of recognition, followed immediately by a wave of shame and fear. She quickly looked down, gripping her cart handle so tightly her knuckles were white, and scurried away down the next aisle. I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction, no anger. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of pity. Her obsession with power and control had cost her everything: her home, her savings, her reputation, and her freedom. She was a self-inflicted casualty of her own miserable war. I finished my shopping and didn't see her again. It was the final, silent closing of that chapter of my life. Looking back on the whole absurd affair, I often think about the nature of power. Carol was given a tiny sliver of authority, the presidency of a sleepy suburban HOA, and it metastasized in her mind into an empire. She confused rules with righteousness and compliance with respect. She believed that by controlling every blade of grass and every mailbox, she was creating order. But she was really just strangling the life out of a community. She never understood that a neighborhood isn't a balance sheet or a list of regulations. It's a collection of people. It's Mrs. Gable getting her medicine. It's kids being able to ride the school bus. It's helping someone dig out from a snowstorm, not because a rule says you have to, but because it's the right thing to do. The moral of the story, if there is one, is that bullies, no matter how much power they seem to have, are often standing on a very fragile foundation. They thrive on intimidation and apathy. But when confronted with facts, reason, and a community that decides it has had enough, their power evaporates. We didn't defeat Carol with anger or threats. We defeated her with her own bylaws, with public records, and with the simple, undeniable truth of a canceled check. Her own obsession with rules became the instrument of her undoing. My life is back to the way I like it, quiet and predictable. I go to work at the county lot. I come home. I wave to my neighbors. Mr. Henderson and I still get coffee sometimes and talk about how nice the new playground is. The F250 is parked in my driveway now, not on the street. Not because of any rule, but because I had the driveway widened last year. But I know that if another snowpocalypse ever hits, I can park it wherever I need to, and the only thing my neighbors will bring me is a hot thermos and a thank you. The war is over. We won. And all that's left is the peace that follows. It's a good feeling. It feels like home.